interviewing Mr. Truman Warner. Good afternoon, Mr. Warner. Why did you write this book?
Why? Well, it grew out of a series that the News Times was developing about a year ago. And because of my interest in Danbury, they asked me to do an overview of the history of Danbury. And then when the tricentennial got underway, they asked if they could use the same material with a few changes and other illustrations. And they did so.
Where did you, okay, wait. Where did you first find the old pictures and documents?
Most of those were located in the Scott Fenton Museum. I collected a few things myself and they used them, but most of them were in the museum.
Kathy?
What, how long did it take you to write it?
Oh, forever. Even a little thing as small as this, because I was trying to do something different. I wasn't just trying to copy and compile. Gathering the information, well, it's been put together over a period of years. This is only a little portion of what I would like to do. But it took me several weeks to write the thing.
Tom?
I have nothing to do with that, so what was early life in colonial days?
Well, it depends what you want to know about it. Can you be a little bit more specific? It's kind of, why I say that is because it would be like saying to anybody here, what is life in Danbury like today?
About the original Indians?
Or the Indians themselves, as far as we know, frankly, we have very little information about them because the records of Danbury were burned, as I think you're well aware. And consequently, we don't even know who the Indians were by name, who sold the land. We know nothing about it because all that went up in flames. We do know something about the Indians themselves based upon what was found in nearby communities. They call this area, as I'm sure you know, also Pacquiao, which means open space or open land. Obviously, they thought the open land was important because remember, they were basically farmers, small farmers, horticulturalists, and they raised squash and beans and things of this nature. But they also hunted, and they went to the coast very often and got clams and shellfish. They went to the Housatonic River and got shad and eels and so on. They weren't permanently located here in one spot. By that I mean they would farm an area in the summer maybe for a few years. And then when they used up that land and it wasn't very good, they'd let it lie fallow for a while and let the stuff grow up on it and move somewhere else. And then in the summer, oftentimes they'd leave it for a while with a few people behind and go down to the coast. In the winter, they usually didn't stay in that spot. They went somewhere where they were protected by the hills, up against a hillside, and where there was a lot of hunting. And they moved their grain and their corn and whatever to that spot. So they moved around a lot. They didn't, if you go out today and say, well, can I find a permanent Indian village or spot, you'd never find one in this area. You'd find where they had camped, but you wouldn't find any walls or anything of this kind that would be permanent, because they didn't stay put. Now, I don't know whether that answers you. I can go on and on and on, but for I'll stop for a minute with that. Come back to it if you want later.
Okay.
Stacy?
What was Danbury's part in the Revolutionary War?
Oh. I mean, you want me to spend 2 or 3 hours? Danbury really played a much more important part in the Revolution than it is normally given credit for. Mrs. Schling, who is writing another one of these booklets that's going to be out, I don't know, in a couple of months or so. She is writing on one particular aspect of it. Let me tell you just a bit about it. Let me show you why it was important. I don't know what I can or not, but I'll do my best. Let us say, here is New York City, okay? And the British captured New York City shortly after the beginning of the war, and they were there for the entire war, okay? From New York City, the Hudson River goes north, okay? And then here is Westchester and Putnam and Dutchess counties and so forth. Here's Connecticut, here's Massachusetts, etc. Now, one of the main objectives of the British was not just to sit in New York City. It was to go up the Hudson River and therefore cut off New England from the rest, because New England was very active in the war and they had a lot of provisions, and they hoped that they could split the colonies into little sections, you know, divide and conquer. So, after Washington was pushed out of New York, he immediately sensed what he had to do to protect it. And so he had troops all through here, but right at the Hudson River, about near West Point. If you ever been there, you know what I mean. It narrows and there's a kind of a bend in the river. All right? The ships would have to come up and around there if they went north. Otherwise, the troops would have to come across the land. Right? So Washington said, all right, we're going to put a lot of defensive measures right there. Then, that's at the end of what are called the Hudson Highlands. They start down here and go across New York. And by the way, most people don't know this, they end right here in Danbury at the western border. So these mountains go east and west. Okay? So Washington was going to have a very strong defensive measure in these mountains here, in case the British did move up and the troops here were destroyed. Okay? All right, how are you going to keep that going? Because the British weren't moving out. So Washington had a strong point here, and then he had other points here on the other side of the Hudson. Then at this end, because there's a break in the mountains here, if you go west, you know, go west on Route 6 toward Brewster, you don't have to go over a lot of hills. That's one of the few breaks that you have in these mountains in Connecticut. All right? So here was Danbury. They said, okay, we want a spot that is inland from the ocean because the British can come in and take the supplies here. Right? We want a place that is not on the Hudson, because then they might come up and burn those supplies. They didn't think they'd ever get to Danbury. They did, of course. And they said, all right, we'll choose Danbury, and we'll have a big supply line here. Then, all over Connecticut and other places, they can funnel things into Danbury. They also did it in the north, in Sharon and that area. But right here, they did it also. Then, here's the problem of getting across the Housatonic River. Washington built a bridge for his troops there, so a very early bridge was leading right into here. So here you have Danbury at a pivotal point, and Danbury was on the edge of the fighting because the British came out to here all the while, was on the in the fighting, or the edge of it, all during the war, for the entire war period. And what did they do in Danbury? Well, they did a lot of things. They collected food. They now know that they had what they call artificers here, who were men who made things, all kinds of, they think they made some of the chains that went across the Hudson. They floated some chains across here to keep the British from going up. They made arms, they made all kinds of things here in Danbury. They made shoes, they packed pork and grains. In other words, it was a major area in the Revolutionary War. I can go on, but most people don't realize that it was, I mean historians don't, because this hasn't been brought out very much. It was a major pivotal point during the war. All kinds of troops were here. Washington was here, Alexander Hamilton, all kinds of people went through here, stayed here, knew the place. I'll go on whenever you ask other questions, but I better stop on that one.
Can you tell us anything about the history of Western Connecticut State University?
Yeah, I can tell you, I don't know how much. First,
being one of the people who started Western Connecticut State University. When did it start? What was it like originally?
it started, I'm not sure the exact date, about 1903, 1904. It started because states needed teachers, and they wanted trained teachers. Previous to that, a lot of the people who had taught had just finished high school, maybe, and then went out and taught in the country schools, and they decided across the country that they needed teachers, and they needed trained teachers. So they started and opened up the old main building that you all know over here, around 1903, 1905, I don't know exactly when it was opened. Then the land was given by a man by the name of White in Danbury, for whom White Street is named. And gradually over the years, I don't know how much detail we can go into here, it went from a 2-year school, and then 3 years as they decided that people needed more training, and then it eventually went to 4 years as a teacher's. It was a normal school first, then a teacher's college. Then it became a state college, and then it became Western Connecticut State College, and then 2 or 3 years ago it became Western Connecticut State University. Now in the process it stopped being just a teacher training institution, and for many, many, many years has trained people and prepared people in all kinds of fields. So we've got people out of there that are in lawyers and doctors and professors and chemists and physicists. And one of my students, can't even remember her name now, not very long ago, I read in the paper she was one of the persons in the Navy in Antarctica doing some work in that area. She joined the service, she had been active in it when she was in college and stayed in it, and she was working down there. So you find out people all over the world.
Richard?
Who were some of Danbury settlers and where did they come from?
Well, the early settlers were basically from Norwalk, and there were 8 families. And they brought their youngsters with them, so there probably were 50 people, maybe, that moved in. And they came here because they felt that they weren't going to have enough land in Norwalk for their children. And so they moved up here where there was more land. And believe it or not, in a couple of generations, those children were moving out to other areas because they felt the land in Danbury was already filled up. Not, a few thousand people, not very many.
Kathy?
Where did you find your pictures and documents?
Well, the documents, everywhere. Documents I found in Hartford in the State Historical Society. Found a lot of documents in Connecticut State Library. I found a lot of them in books that had been printed in the past. I found them in microfilm. I found them all over the place. What you do is find a little piece here and a little piece there, and you put it together. Unfortunately, it's not in one spot for you, as you discovered. I think you're doing some work and you're trying to get a hold of a variety of people to get some information.
It is tough, yeah.
It's not easy.
You have another question?
Why did the hatting industry collapse, and how did the city's economy change?
Pardon? The first part of the question.
Why did the hatting industry collapse?
No one knows for sure, but I think it collapsed because, well, one basic reason is very simple, and it sounds like a stupid answer, because people stopped wearing hats. And they think maybe they stopped doing that. One reason being that, and they began to make automobiles with lower roofs, and men didn't like the idea of getting in and having their hats knocked off every time they got in the car. No one knows for sure why. Styles changed, and they just stopped wearing hats.
Stacy?
Can you tell us about the history of Western Connecticut State University?
We did that.
Well, I have no more.
Why Hatting in Danbury? Why not another?
No one knows that for sure. You read accounts where it says that the first hatting industry started in Danbury, and that simply is not so. There were lots of hatters in the colonies before that. No one knows why it started here, except that apparently somebody with skill decided he was going to teach other people to do it, and it spread quite rapidly, particularly since World War, since the Revolutionary War. But no one knows. No one sure at all why it
We've
started.
had hatters in town tell us such things as the water was very good in Danbury for making hats. We've had people
Could
say
be.
that
I'm sure it was.
beaver colonies were in the area. And
But they were all over the
they were
country.
all over. So you're saying that Danbury really,
I don't think nobody knows.
nobody really knows what it is.
Nobody knows what. And remember, there were hats made in lots of places in the colonies at this time. But Danbury seemed to get a very good start. If you wonder why it expanded, I might be able to give an example of that. We had some people here in Danbury who were very clever, well, what you would call today entrepreneurs. They went out to sell, and they made hats in Danbury and then sold. One brother would live in Danbury and have a lot of people making hats, and he would ship them by boat to Georgia and South Carolina. And they had big stores down there. I'm talking about not 1900s, I'm talking about 1810, 1811, 180 years ago. And they shipped them, and they were just clever men who worked hard, and the more they sold, the more hats they made here. And then the more hats, the more they felt they had to sell. So I'm guessing part of it had to do that there were good, clever businessmen in those early days that happened to be located here. That's why it grew. As well as good water and things of that. Nearness to New York City would have helped, because it was a good outlet. New York wasn't very big then. We think of New York City. There were only 5 cities in the country in 1790 that were over 10,000 people. And that they weren't much over it. So
Wow.
it was
That's nothing. Danbury today is how many? About 60, 70,000?
60, 70,000.
So
Now, New York had more than 10. I don't remember the numbers, but it wasn't a huge place.
Last question. This is not your whole book. You're still working on something. Could you tell me a little bit about what you're working on?
Oh, well, this is what I did here was just to take little pieces and put it together. But I hope that you noticed, I don't know whether you did or not, maybe my point wasn't clear. History is not just gathering data and putting it down in a chronological form. History involves trying to make some sense out of it, trying to find out why things were caused. And one of my assumptions is that activities are caused by the way people get their energy from the environment. In other words, the early colonial settlers got their energy from the environment primarily by farming. And they fed themselves. They were the engines. And then those engines worked. The Indians did it by hunting and farming in a different way. And then it changed and we began to use water power. And it went on, we used coal, etc. Every time those changes occurred, big changes occurred in Danbury. I'll show you what I mean. Right now, we and the rest of the country are in a period of tremendous change. Anybody know primarily what that change of energy? We've got a lot of it. Energy and technology is. What would you say it is? Anybody willing to?
Are we going to nuclear?
Nuclear. Sure. And the machines are basically what? Computers and robots. Now we don't know how that's going to affect us, but we're in one of those periods of change right now. So when I wrote this history, I tried to divide it by periods of that nature. And for example, 1850 I chose because In the early 1850s, railways came to Danbury. Now you say, what has that got to do with energy? Well, to some extent it does have, because it's machinery. But also because then they could bring coal in quantities. Up to that time it had been brought up in wagons. And some men, before the trains came, brought in, several tons, and it took him several years to get rid of it. By 1860, huge quantities of coal were being used to heat schools, if nothing else.
Thank you very much for joining us at such short notice. Do you have one last question?
Can I sign off?
You want to sign off?
Yeah.
Okay. This is our Jimmy
Sign off, man.
Sign off, man.
Good, good.
This is Truman Warner, Alternative Center for Education, Danbury, Connecticut. Signing off, James Lee, and may the good news be yours.